As the Habsburg monarchy entered the late 19th century, Austria's opposition to revolutionary movements and its reliance on repressive measures increasingly began to work against the stability of the empire. The creation of the dual monarchy in 1867, following Austria's defeat by Prussia and the concessions made to the Hungarians, was intended as a pragmatic solution to the empire's internal problems. However, while it temporarily addressed the demands of Hungary, it failed to resolve the deep-seated tensions between the various ethnic groups living under Habsburg rule. Instead, the creation of Austria-Hungary exacerbated divisions within the empire, as Slavic populations, Czechs, Croats, Serbs, Poles, and others, became more vocal in their demands for autonomy and recognition of their national identities. Austria-Hungary, governed as two separate entities under the same monarch, Emperor Franz Joseph, continued to rely on authoritarian methods to maintain control. While Hungary had gained significant autonomy, the other nationalities within the empire were left out of the new political arrangement, and their grievances deepened as a result. The emperor, whose reign lasted from 1848 to 1916, symbolized the continuity of the old order, but by the late 19th century, the Habsburg centuries-old model of centralized rule was increasingly outdated. The rise of nationalist movements across Europe, coupled with the rapid pace of industrialization and modernization, left Austria-Hungary looking like a relic of a bygone era. The nationalism that had fueled the revolutions of 1848 did not dissipate with the dual monarchy. Instead, it intensified. In the Czech lands, the national revival movement gathered strength as Czechs sought greater recognition of their language and culture, as well as political autonomy. In Croatia, the rise of Croatian nationalism posed a similar challenge to Habsburg authority, while in Galicia, Polish nationalism became a growing force. These nationalist movements were further fueled by Austria-Hungary's refusal to grant political reforms and continued suppression of dissent through censorship, imprisonment, and military force. The use of brute force to maintain control was particularly evident in Austria-Hungary's dealings with its Slavic populations. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, the Habsburg regime imposed a harsh military occupation in an effort to suppress nationalist uprisings. The empire's response to Slavic nationalism was marked by violence and repression, with Austrian troops deployed to crush any hint of rebellion. The empire's security forces routinely arrested and executed nationalist leaders, while the police state kept a close watch on political agitators. Yet these measures only served to strengthen the resolve of nationalist movements, which increasingly sought support from outside the empire, particularly from Serbia and Russia. The Balkan region, often described as the powder keg of Europe, became a focal point of Austria-Hungary's internal struggles and external rivalries. The growing influence of Serbia, which had emerged as a champion of Slavic nationalism in the region, posed a direct threat to Habsburg authority. Serbia's support for Slavic nationalist movements, particularly among the empire's South Slavs, was viewed with great suspicion by Vienna. The Austrian government, fearful of the empire's disintegration, adopted an increasingly belligerent stance towards Serbia, culminating in a series of diplomatic crises that set the stage for the outbreak of World War I. In the years leading up to 1914, Austria-Hungary found itself in a precarious position, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, the empire was fractured along ethnic lines, with growing demands for political reform from Czechs, Croats, and other nationalities. The Habsburgs, however, remained intransigent, refusing to yield to these demands and instead continuing their reliance on coercion and repression to maintain order. Internationally, Austria-Hungary's position as a great power was increasingly overshadowed by the rise of Germany and the intensification of rivalries in the Balkans. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne, by a Bosnian Serb nationalist in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was the spark that ignited the First World War, but the seeds of the conflict had been sown long before. Austria-Hungary's response to the assassination was swift and aggressive. Believing that Serbia was responsible for the attack, Vienna issued an ultimatum to the Serbian government, demanding sweeping concessions that would have effectively reduced Serbia to the status of an Austrian vassal state. When Serbia, with the backing of Russia, refused to comply fully with the ultimatum, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914. What followed was the descent of Europe into a conflict of unprecedented scale, as the complex web of alliances and rivalries drew the major powers into war. For Austria-Hungary, World War I represented both a final, desperate attempt to maintain its position as a great power and the beginning of the empire's ultimate collapse. From the outset, Austria-Hungary's military was ill-prepared for the conflict. The empire's armies, composed of soldiers from a multitude of ethnic groups, were plagued by internal divisions and a lack of cohesion. Many soldiers, particularly those from Slavic regions, had little loyalty to the Habsburg regime and were reluctant to fight for a government that had long oppressed them. Desertions were common, and the empire's military efforts were hampered by poor leadership and logistical failures. The war placed an immense strain on Austria-Hungary's already fragile political and social fabric. The empire's economy, which had been struggling even before the war, was unable to sustain the demands of a prolonged conflict. Food shortages, inflation, and deteriorating living conditions led to widespread discontent among the population. Strikes and protests broke out across the empire, as workers and peasants demanded an end to the war and relief from the hardships they were facing. The government's attempts to suppress these protests through force only fueled further unrest. Nationalist movements within the empire seized upon the chaos of the war to advance their own agendas. In Hungary, demands for greater autonomy turned into outright calls for independence, while in the Czech lands, nationalist leaders like Tomáš Masaryk and Edvard Beneš worked to establish an independent Czechoslovak state. In the South Slavic regions, Croatian and Serbian leaders began to advocate for the creation of a unified South Slavic state, free from Habsburg rule. The empire's reliance on repression to maintain control was no longer sustainable, as the war had exposed the deep fractures within Austrian society. By 1916, as the war dragged on with no end in sight, the once unshakable authority of the Habsburg monarchy began to crumble. The death of Emperor Franz Joseph in November of that year marked the end of an era. His successor, Emperor Karl I, attempted to negotiate a peace settlement and implement political reforms to save the empire, but was too late. The centrifugal forces of nationalism and revolution were now too powerful to contain. As World War I reached its final stages in 1918, Austria-Hungary was on the brink of collapse. The empire's military was in disarray, its economy in ruins, and its population in open revolt. In October 1918, nationalist leaders from across the empire declared their independence, effectively dismantling the Habsburg monarchy. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary all emerged as independent states, while other regions of the former empire, such as Galicia and Transylvania, were absorbed by neighboring countries. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, signed in 1919, officially dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Empire, bringing an end to centuries of Habsburg rule in Central Europe. The collapse of Austria-Hungary was a direct consequence of the empire's inability to adapt to the changing political landscape of Europe. The Habsburgs' refusal to grant meaningful political reforms, their reliance on repression to maintain control, and their failure to address the growing demands of nationalism all contributed to the empire's downfall. Austria-Hungary's involvement in World War I was the final act in a long history of opposition to revolutionary movements and resistance to change. The legacy of Austria's brutal suppression of revolution and nationalism is one of repression, conflict, and eventual disintegration. The Habsburg monarchy, once one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, had fallen victim to its own intransigence. Its refusal to embrace the forces of change left it vulnerable to the very movements it sought to suppress. In the end, Austria's attempts to hold back the tide of revolution only hastened the collapse of its empire. The fall of Austria-Hungary in 1918 marked not only the end of a dynasty, but also the end of an era. The map of Europe was redrawn, and the nationalist movements that had once been brutally suppressed by the Habsburgs finally achieved their goal of independence. Yet the legacy of Austria's opposition to revolution would continue to shape the region for decades to come, as the new states that emerged from the ashes of the empire struggled to find their place in a rapidly changing world. The failure of Austria-Hungary to reconcile the forces of nationalism and reform serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of repression and the inevitability of change. Thus concludes the story of Austria's opposition to revolution, a tale of repression, brutality, and eventual collapse. The Habsburgs may have held back the tide of revolution for a time, but in the end, the forces of nationalism and change proved to be unstoppable. The empire's refusal to adapt to the new realities of the 19th and 20th centuries ultimately sealed its fate, and the once mighty Habsburg monarchy was consigned to the pages of history. The end of Austria-Hungary in 1918 not only marked the dissolution of a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, but also the culmination of centuries of efforts to stifle revolution and reform. The collapse of the Habsburg monarchy reflected the deep contradictions between its rigid, conservative rule and the inevitable push for change that had been simmering across Europe since the early 19th century. The brutal measures the Habsburgs employed to suppress revolutions, whether in 1848, during the rise of nationalist movements, or in the face of socialist and liberal demands, left a lasting imprint on the collective memory of the various peoples who had lived under their rule. The repression, censorship, and militarized responses to any form of dissent created a culture of resistance that did not disappear with the fall of the empire. Instead, these movements often gained strength from the very repression they sought to overcome. In the decades following the empire's collapse, the new nations that emerged faced their own challenges. The multinational makeup of Austria-Hungary had been a source of tension, but had also created a shared history among its peoples. The sudden emergence of new states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and a significantly reduced Hungary brought new political complexities. These new nations struggled to integrate the many ethnicities that had lived together within the empire, and the scars left by Habsburg repression persisted in many forms. In Czechoslovakia, tensions between Czechs and Slovaks lingered. In Yugoslavia, the union of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was fraught with deep-seated animosities that Austria had both suppressed and, in some cases, inflamed. Moreover, the political vacuum left by the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy and the disintegration of its imperial structures allowed for the rise of new, often more radical ideologies. In many cases, the repressive tactics employed by the Habsburgs provided a model for subsequent authoritarian regimes in the region. The brutal responses to revolution, the stifling of political dissent, and the manipulation of nationalist sentiments to maintain control would all be echoed in the totalitarian systems that emerged in the 20th century, particularly in the wake of the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. The Habsburg legacy of repression and authoritarianism also reverberated through Austria itself in the interwar period. The truncated Austrian state, now a small, landlocked republic, struggled with the loss of its imperial identity. Many Austrians, particularly conservatives, yearned for the return of the old order and were unable to reconcile themselves with a new republican reality. This internal division contributed to the political instability that Austria experienced in the 1920s and 1930s. In 1934, a brief civil war erupted between the socialist movement and the authoritarian, clerical fascist regime of Engelbert Dollfuss. Austria became a microcosm of the larger struggles that had plagued Europe since the 19th century. The conflict between revolution and reaction, between reform and repression. The brutal crackdown on the socialist uprising in Vienna in 1934, which saw government forces bombarding the working-class districts of the city, bore chilling similarities to the methods the Habsburgs had used in the past to crush dissent. It was as if Austria had learned little from its imperial history, continuing to rely on military force and authoritarianism in the face of popular demands for social and political change. This pattern of repression culminated in Austria's annexation by Nazi Germany in 1938, known as the Anschluss. Austria, deprived of its empire and grappling with political and economic instability, had become increasingly polarized, with a significant portion of the population supporting the idea of union with Germany. The repression of leftist movements, combined with the rise of far-right ideologies, had paved the way for Austria's absorption into the Third Reich. The legacy of the Habsburgs' authoritarianism and the failure of Austria to embrace democratic reform made the country vulnerable to the totalitarian impulses of fascism. The horrors that followed under Nazi rule, particularly the brutal oppression of minority groups, political dissidents, and Jews, can be seen as an extension of the broader European history of authoritarianism and repression. While the Nazi regime represented a radical departure from the Habsburgs' relatively conservative monarchy, it also built on the legacy of authoritarian control that had long defined Austria's political culture. In the aftermath of World War II, Austria was forced to confront its role in these atrocities and to reevaluate its historical relationship with power, repression, and revolution. The post-war era brought significant changes to Austria, as it sought to distance itself from its fascist past and redefine its identity within a democratic framework. Yet the shadow of its imperial and authoritarian history loomed large, influencing political debates and national memory well into the 20th century. As Austria and the other successor states of the Habsburg Empire moved into the modern era, the questions raised by the empire's long struggle against revolution remained unresolved. The rise of socialism and communism in Eastern Europe after World War II represented another chapter in the ongoing struggle between revolutionary ideals and authoritarian control. Many of the new communist regimes in the region, particularly in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, employed similarly repressive tactics as their Habsburg predecessors to maintain control, suppressing uprisings in 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Czechoslovakia with brutal force. In this way, the legacy of Austria's opposition to revolution continued to shape the political landscape of Central and Eastern Europe well into the late 20th century. The collapse of communism in the region in 1989, which led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the emergence of democratic governments, was in many ways the final act in the long drama that had begun with the revolutions of 1848. The peoples of Central Europe, after more than a century of repression, war, and totalitarianism, finally achieved the political freedoms and national self-determination that they had long sought. Austria, by the end of the 20th century, had transformed itself into a modern, democratic state. The dark legacy of its imperial past, however, continued to influence its national consciousness. Austria's role in suppressing revolution, both during the Habsburg era and in the interwar period, remained a topic of historical debate and reflection. The brutality with which the Habsburgs had dealt with revolutionary movements, the oppression of nationalist aspirations, and the authoritarian tendencies that persisted into the 20th century are all part of the complex history of Austria's relationship with revolution and reform. The Austrian example serves as a broader lesson for the history of Europe and the world. It illustrates the dangers of attempting to resist the forces of change through repression and violence. The Habsburg monarchy, for all its power and longevity, was ultimately unable to prevent the rise of new political and social realities. Its failure to adapt to the revolutionary movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries not only hastened its own demise, but also left a legacy of conflict and authoritarianism that would haunt Europe for decades to come. In conclusion, Austria's long history of opposition to revolution is a story of missed opportunities and tragic consequences. The Habsburgs' reliance on repression to maintain their empire, their failure to embrace meaningful reform, and their brutal treatment of nationalist and revolutionary movements all contributed to the eventual collapse of one of Europe's greatest dynasties. The legacy of that opposition continues to shape the history of Central and Eastern Europe, reminding us of the perils of resisting the inevitable tide of change.